EU trade policy and the green way forward. This is an introduction to the European Union's trade policy and the green angle on how international trade can be made more responsible, fair and transparent. The European Union is a major international trading power, accounting for 16% of the global trade in goods. Not only has trade been at the heart of the creation of the European Union itself, but beyond that, the EU has established trade relations with countries all over the world in order to gain access to foreign markets, with the aim of strengthening the European economy. The EU has so far concluded over 40 free trade agreements. In 2017, CETA, or CETA, the trade agreement between the EU and Canada, has been approved by the European Parliament, and free trade accords with Vietnam and Japan are underway. For many countries around the world, such as India, Mexico, Egypt or Brazil, the EU is their #1 trading partner. Seems like EU trade policy is on the right track, doesn't it? Well, not exactly. In recent years, especially throughout the negotiations on TTIP, the controversial trade agreement between the EU and the United States, EU trade policy has faced strong resistance by European citizens, as well as opposition from national and regional governments, with Greens at the forefront. What is wrong with EU trade policy à la TTIP? Let's first have a look at how the decision-making process on free trade agreements looks. Trade policy is an exclusive power of the European Union. This means that the EU, and not the individual member states, negotiates free trade agreements. First, the European Council, representing the EU member states' governments, needs to initiate the negotiations by giving a mandate to the European Commission. In this mandate, member states set out the objectives the trade agreement should achieve. On the basis of this, the European Commission starts discussing the details of the trade agreement with the trading partner. Every topic has a separate chapter. Once the negotiation partners agree on a chapter, it is considered closed. The process consists of several rounds of talks. Depending on the pace, negotiations can range from 2 or 3 years to much longer. After every negotiation round, the European Commission has to report to the European Council and the European Parliament. Once the negotiators have agreed on all details, the text is given to the European Parliament. Next, the agreement is formally signed by the European Commission and the trading partner. After that, the agreement is transmitted to the European Parliament for consent, which means members of the European Parliament can either say yes or no to the agreement. Only now does the trade agreement come into effect. So, what is the problem with EU trade policy? Democratic deficit and lacking transparency. The process of how EU trade agreements are concluded is not democratic and transparent enough, because the European Parliament, as the directly elected institution of its citizens, has too few powers. It is neither involved in drafting the mandate, which sets out the trade agreement's objectives, nor can it change the final text agreed upon by the negotiators. Undermining the rule of law. TTIP and other EU free trade agreements under negotiation allow for private court systems. These courts exist outside the regular legal system and enable corporations to sue state authorities and challenge democratically adopted laws that seem to stand in corporations' way of making profits. For example, they could challenge environmental standards. Such mechanisms weaken our legal system and might eventually endanger our environment and health. Threat of deregulation. Trade deals seek to harmonize production standards between trading partners in order to make it easier for both sides to exchange goods and services. The EU, for example, has stricter rules on the use of pesticides in agriculture, whereas the US has stricter rules on how to produce medical devices. If both sides adopted the higher standard of their trading partner, that would be great. But here's the trick. Corporations have an interest in the cheapest rather than the best standard being adopted in the agreement. This is highly dangerous for food safety, public health and the environment, and can lead to a lowering of standards overall. So are Greens against free trade? quite the opposite. Greens are strongly in favour of a common EU trade policy. But trade agreements need to deliver more than they currently do. Trade agreements have the potential to be a driving force for responsible, fair and inclusive trade. To do so, they need to benefit people and the planet, not only big corporations.